Hey guys, what's up? This chapter is a bit of an addition to the Preflop chapter. It's gonna be a bit theoretical, but very, very practical, of course. And you might disagree with some points. There are a few different approaches, but yeah, before I start rambling, I'll kind of explain the subject. So, if you're implementing a lot of the preflop exploits or postflop exploits, the thing that will often happen is that you will get into a spot with a range that is very, very one-sided. I'll give you guys an example. Let's say you were playing BVB and you know your opponent overfolds a bit and under 3-bets a bit, and you've done the math and you understand that you can actually profitably open, say, 80% of pre-flop hands against this player, maybe even 100%, so you're doing it. You now reach the flop, and you have a 100% range, while your opponent has a tighter one. Now, if you've worked on your post-flop strategy, your post-flop strategy is geared towards a certain range, and it's not this one. Okay, it's not this one. And this range is actually weaker than your opponent's range, and I want to actually show this in a really simple example. Let's say we have a single raise pot and we're button versus big blind. And in this spot, we are opening button, 80% of hands because, opponents are not good. And here I will simplify the game tree to make the sim run quickly and be small. This is, again, anyone who's thinking about buying a solver, using a solver, you don't have a strong computer. Part of what I like about using the solver to study in the ways that I'm doing is that you don't need to have all the options in there. That definitely not for our purposes. So, yeah, you open this really wide range, you get board that is usually quite good for you. So Jack 10-4. And we'll run the tree, and you guys need to think that this is not a sim you've ever seen, right? Because these two ranges never get paired together. So just to train your intuition, I would recommend guessing what post-flop strategy would look like if we widen and widen and widen our range, while keeping villain's range, actually, if we're quite there, let's actually not keep villain's range the same. We'll actually make it stronger because, presumably he's under 3-betting a bit, so he should have more of these kind of nice hands. And maybe he's overfolding a bit, so he should have a few less of these hands, right? The bottom of range hands, a few less of these, a few less of these. So I'm just kind of playing around with the range. Nothing that I'm doing here is very dramatic, nor is it very calculated. We're just pushing the simulation in the direction that we want in order to look at the direction of the adjustment. So what kind of things might happen? Well, one thing that might happen is that we actually lose the initiative. So our range actually becomes weaker than our opponent's range. And that means that he should actually be donk betting, and certainly if he isn't, which he won't because we're not giving him that option, we hardly ever bet. We bet very, very narrow, very polarized range, and then this 30% size is not a thing. And the reason we bet very narrow in a very polarized range is that, when your opponent's range is stronger and you have lots of medium strength stuff and he's clairvoyant, right? He knows your range is stronger than his. If you bet, you give him an opportunity to check raise. And really you need to defend all your medium strength shitty stuff, right? So here you can see against a check, we actually bet just 32% of the time. And look how defensive of a strategy this is, right? We still want to bet 4s, 10s, and jacks, and maybe queens. We build a betting range around that. But we're checking back most aces and ace-jack, and being overall super, super passive. And when we bet our opponent doesn't check raise too wide because that's our range. But in terms of like equity, he has 55% equity and we have 45%. So certainly he should have been donk betting. And even when it comes to EV, he is equal in EV despite not being able to donk bet the flop and us being in position and us having the on-capped range with aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, hands that our opponent does not have. It's jack 10. He doesn't have tens through aces and still you're roughly equal in EV. So this scenario happens and it's an important question how to deal with it. And I'll give you guys a few approaches. You can take either one. This is not science, but I think it's important to understand that if you open 80% and he defends tight, and then you range bet, and then he check raises, and you play the whole post-flop game tree kind of normal, you are running a risk. Okay? So basically our entire calculation pre-flop assumed post-flop would play normal. Okay? So when we open Queen 4 off on the button, we're making 10 BB per 100 or a tenth of the big blind. Playing 50, 100, we made $10. The entire idea of winning the $10 means that we both play normal post-flop. But if my range is weaker and I am range betting, I'm not playing normal post-flop. I'm playing very unbalanced, and the range versus range situation opens me up to a very big exploit. Simple way to illustrate this in words would be to say, you know, I stole your money pre-flop. Let's not give it back post-flop, right? Like, I already won $10. Now, if I c-bet everything, run it with my weak range into your strong range, is that really what I want to do? Because that might lose me the dollars back, right? And even more. So this brings us to a couple of questions that are fairly important and you need to ask yourselves, and there's a debate. Different people do this differently. So you can choose your poison, so to speak, how to treat the situation. Okay, so one way you could treat the situation would be to say, okay, these are now our ranges. I'm going to play as though they are our ranges. I realize that my range is now very weak compared to yours because I've widened it pre-flop. So I'm going to take a much more defensive stance. I'm going to pretend you had the initiative. I'm going to check back a lot on the flop and just play super defensive. And what happens, happens. You know what? Like we said, as long as I don't mess up, I made my money. So this is one way to go. That would mean that when you open super wide BBB, you then check your range on almost every flop. You're out of position against a stronger range, just like you check big blind versus a button open. If you over 3-bet someone because he's over folding, you now check to him on almost every flop. So comes king, queen, 3. You check. Okay? Whether you have aces, whether you have 4-7 suited that you 3-bet bluffed with. I think this is the safest option. And it is one that I use reasonably often in heads-up matches. Heads-up matches, everything you do is more visible. It also has the benefit of hiding information in that your weak hands will very often not get to showdown when you play like this. So this would be one option. Okay. Another option would be to say, you know, I'll play my normal range normally, and if I have a wider hand, I will play it in that way. Because here you're not thinking of your strategy as a whole, or maybe you are a bit. You're keeping things simpler for yourself. You're like, if I have a normal hand, sure, you're a bit tighter, but it's not that big of a deal. I still have a range advantage. And the steal hands, you know, they stole, they made their money. Unless they flop something good, I'm done with them. Not building my strategy around these shitty hands. I don't feel the need to protect their equity, leaving them on their own in a battlefield to be taken prisoner. This strategy would also work. And what this strategy might have going for it a bit is if you go button versus big blind and you say, well, you know, let's say my opponent under 3 bets. Well, we'll show this in the Monker sim. Okay, so We open button 2.5x, and you guys can see big blind 3-bet range. Now, does under 3-betting means he doesn't 3-bet nines and doesn't 3-bet ace-jack? Or does it mean he doesn't 3-bet ace-5 off and ace-4 off and jack-6 suited? Which one is it? Because if he's tighter with a value range, then his pre-flop range gets stronger. But if he just misses bluffs, his pre-flop range actually gets weaker. It's important, despite under 3-betting. His 3-bet range gets stronger, certainly, but his calling range gets weaker. And so you could play your normal range normal or even a bit more aggressive than usual and put your weak hands to the side. But yeah, just because someone is 3-betting less doesn't mean he's, calling stronger. Right? It doesn't have to come from the linear part of the 3-bet range. Similarly, just because someone is check raising less doesn't mean his calling range is stronger. So now I'm talking about pre-flop, but we talked about how flop play, if your opponent doesn't check raise, then just half potting your range is a really good counter. Like really, really strong counter to someone who doesn't check raise. Half potting, third potting, I think half potting is actually better if your opponent's not check raising. But it's, it opens you up to a bigger counter. Let's say I range bet and my opponent calls and I know he's under check raising. Maybe he's still check raising all the sets in 2 pairs and he's just missing bluffs. And then his range on the turn is actually weaker than usual. Okay, so important to keep in mind there are nuances here that we want to be aware of. But just because someone's frequency is lower in a line doesn't necessarily mean in which way he's constructing his ranges. So your strategy for the next streets still has some flexibility. Now, another thing you could say is that, say I'm button versus big blind. We'll go back to this spot. Okay. I am button versus big blind, and I get here with this range. And I know that my normal strategy should be to bet everything. Or let's say against you, right? You under check raise. It's a good board for my normal range. So usually I would bet everything. And I know I can't do that in PO Solver because PO Solver knows my range, but you don't know my range. And then, rather than look at this range, let me draw an alternate scenario for you guys to consider when you're doing this. Okay, so we go back to the normal sim. We shave off the sizings again to keep this sim nice and small because this is not going to affect our c-bet strategy too much. And we put out the sim board. Now I'm going to change the ranges differently. Okay, so out of position range, I still want to shave off some hands to indicate that there is less calling going on. And I'm going to add some hands to indicate. So I am going to make the range stronger. Okay. More of these hands. No. Less of these hands. And whenever I do this, it's super important, right, to note the board. Because maybe the board is ace 4-5 and I just removed 3 deuce, and you might get weird effects if you're not aware of the board. But so here, for example, I added 7s and 8s to make the range stronger. Does that make the range stronger? Well, not on Jack 10-4. Yeah, maybe a little bit. I also added broadways and I removed some stuff here, but then I removed these jacks. And I want maybe the range to be overall stronger, so maybe it's better to leave those in to represent this. But yeah, now in position range, rather than doing 80%, we're going to do it differently. We're going to say, okay, my opponent doesn't know my range changed, so he's going to play as though I have this range. But I'm going to have some trashy trash in here, like this, okay? So I'm going to play in this range when I have 7 deuce off, which means I'm going to play a normal, as though I have a normal range, and I happen to have like 1% of some random hand in there, because I misclicked. But my range is normal, okay? So it requires some thinking, because you are opening yourself up to a huge exploit, but your opponent doesn't know he's not doing this. So why not play normal? Why pretend that you both know you have tons of trash in your range? He doesn't know. He's never gonna know, hopefully. So why not just play your trash as though it's part of a normal range? In which case, bet it when it has a backdoor flush draw, play fairly aggressively. Here we're seeing a tightening up because we did make villain's range stronger. Like I said, whether it is actually stronger is a bit debatable. Sometimes you even open because the small blind is tight and the big blind is normal, and you have a wide range, but the big blind has a normal range. Play the range more like this, so you do bet your 7 deuce sometimes. You do play the rest of your range kind of normal. And this requires, I think, in terms of adjustments from you guys, the minimum amount of adjustments, because all you need to study is the normal strategy. And just because you get there wide doesn't matter too much. But you still want to be making at least, you need to differentiate the situations. So first off, BVB open versus an under 3-better, he might have a weaker range because he might just be missing bluffs. BVB open versus an overfolder, on the other hand, he's going to have a stronger range for sure. Now, this isn't really about play overruns so much, but when someone has a stronger range, you don't want to shovel money into them, right? I think it's just common sense that if you think your opponent's overfolding a lot, and now we called, knit it up a bit with the bluffs. Like, don't go too crazy. Don't be like, oh, this is a good board for me. I want to. No, don't do that stuff. Okay. Similarly, so BVB open, same with button open, but yeah, let's say, so similar thing with 3-betting. Let's say that I decide to 3-bet extra because someone is a tight caller. He's going to have a stronger range because he folds more. Like, there's nowhere, he's not folding the strong hands, he's folding the weak ones. So I want to lower my c-bet strategy, whether I have a normal hand or I have a wide hand. Either way, I don't want to give him the money back. Okay, the money I won by 3-betting wide. But if I'm 3-betting wide because the guy under 4 bets, which is tough to know in terms of sample size, but you might have other reasons to think people under 4 bet, such as just looking at charts and saying, people are gonna miss some of this stuff. For sure. So, if you're 3-betting wide because of the under 4 bet, he might well have a weaker range or a normal range, and then you might want to go the 7 deuce route that I showed. So, it's a bit to think about, right? But you need to have this as part of your game. So if we range bet versus an under check raiser, he might have a weaker range, he might have a normal range. And we will have a weaker range too, for what it's worth, but he doesn't know that. So you could, I think I'd recommend playing normal. Not going too far off from what you would normally do, and trying not to show down the funky hands. But yeah, you could of course play weaker with the funky hands as well. If I range bet versus someone who overfolds, he will certainly have a stronger range, right? And then very often, what I'm going to say is, if I think this guy's overfolding to a flop c-bet, I'm going to shut down with the turn bluffs because I made extra money on the flop and now I run into a stronger than usual range on the turn, which there's a decent chance he will call too much with. So unless I have further reads, I will shut down. Okay? You don't want to win one big blind with a c-bet and then lose 2 big blinds with a turn barrel. That's not the way we want to do it. We win a big blind, we reevaluate. We keep the big blind close to our hearts. We enjoy it. We don't give it back easily. So I think this kind of covers what I want to explain here. Basically, to sum up, you could have 3 different approaches. The first one is to play your entire range versus your opponent's entire range. And this means that you compensate for the fact that your range is wider than usual. I would not recommend this unless you are in a heads-up setting or you're playing three-handed a lot. In those settings, it's better because otherwise, if you play your entire range normal and your range is really weak, you will end up constantly overfolding and over bluffing and all this stuff, and people might notice. And then even though you're trying to play normal, you are actually, overplaying your range by a lot. You don't want to do that if people might notice. But in a 6-max setting or a full ring setting, it's very tough to notice that you're doing this because of how poker works and how long it takes to get samples. So in those cases, I would recommend either the second or the third approach that I pointed out. Second approach would be to play most of your range normal and then play the funky hands as though they are their own range, their own world, and they don't need to see bet unless they hit something good. There's no obligation on them to take a stab at the pot on the flop. Sure, I mean, at some point you do because you don't want to show them that you opened the hand, but no rush. And then the third option is, actually playing those hands as though you have only a random combo of them in your range. In which case you would actually play them fairly normal, fairly aggressive on the flop, and probably just go bet, check, bet with them quite often, unless they turn something good. And yeah, like I was saying, this whole thing goes for any spot where you're exploiting someone. So if he overcalls the turn, he overfolds the turn, how do you play the river? So all the spots, yeah, I guess that's it. If you guys go through the hand examples of me having weak stuff from the pre-flop chapters, you probably notice that I check a lot, even on boards that are fairly good for me. So this is a lot of the reason why. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.